Good evening. From deportation deals to dollar diplomacy, President Trump's high-stakes White House lunch with 5 African leaders reignites debate over the future of U.S.-Africa ties. Are we witnessing a genuine shift or just another attempt to outsource America's borders and bankroll influence? President Donald Trump's surprise mini-summit with leaders from 5 West African nations signals a bold recalibration of U.S.-Africa relations, from proposed migrant deportation agreements to a pivot away from aid and towards trade. Washington is pushing hard to reassert influence in a region increasingly aligned with China. But behind the carefully staged optics of economic partnership, deeper questions loom about sovereignty, legality, and who truly stands to gain. I'm Mana Moselhi, and this is In Focus. President Trump's White House meeting with the 5 West African leaders made headlines not just for its optics, but for the draft deportation proposal quietly circulated behind closed doors. According to Reuters, U.S. officials urged the presidents of Liberia, Senegal, Mauritania, Guinea-Bissau, and Gabon to sign on to a safe third country agreement that would allow the U.S. to deport migrants from other countries to African soil, regardless of nationality. In public, Trump spoke of shifting from aid to trade, but sources confirmed that the deportation plan was a central focus of the lunch. Leaked language from a State Department memo requested African governments to agree to dignified, safe, and timely transfers of migrants, delaying their return to their home countries until the U.S. fully adjudicated their asylum bids. The proposal raised red flags among legal experts, rights groups, and even African civil society, who warn of humanitarian risks, sovereignty issues, and the precedent of outsourcing America's border enforcement to fragile states already grappling with limited resources. We're joined now by Dr. Item Ling Machilta, political analyst at the University of Pretoria. Welcome to In Focus, sir. Hello, Mr. Machilta.
Good evening.
Good evening to you, sir. Now, why do you think the Trump administration is pushing for these safe third country deals now, and why Western countries specifically?
Good evening, and good evening to your viewers. Thank you very much. It's great to be with you. We have to admit that these round of talks between the United States of America and these 5 Western African countries are quite precarious because the biggest player within the region, which happens to be Nigeria, is absent. History tells us that there has been differences between opinion in the region between perhaps, let's say, Nigeria and as well Cameroon, and internal fracas within the region as well. So it's very confusing as to why it is not a broader conversation, because it's going to be affecting the region as a whole. So why the 5, I do not particularly understand, but I think this is more of a confusion-causing exercise rather than a solution-finding one.
Now, how do these proposed agreements compare to past controversial deals like the US-Guatemala or the UK-Rwanda pacts?
It's really just one of those playing those sort of developments that are playing out in front of us, that we can say that we've seen precedents that have not turned out very well. Look at, for instance, with much more peeled eyes on the Rwanda and UK deal that fell flat. I mean, that deal when former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was busy brokering, it was vaunted as a great solution to the problems that the European the European Union is having, and the UK as well. However, it ended up just as a terrible blunder that is still affecting the countries that are involved as well. Now with this Guatemala and US one. Let's also include the ones of the crocodile infested Alcatraz, as it's called, that the United States of America has now resorted to. These are just disastrous and quickly foisted pseudo solutions, but I do not see how they will work out in the short and long term altogether.
Okay. Now, from a legal standpoint, do these plans risk violating international refugee or asylum obligations from your point of view?
Oh, most certainly. Most certainly. Look, the international refugee law is primarily covered by the 1951 Refugee Convention and its protocol of 1967. The 51 convention that was adopted in Geneva defines that the refugees and what a refugee is and what the outlines of the basic rights of the refugees are, including access to courts, education, and so forth. There's many rules that also stipulate that a refugee cannot be returned to the place of danger, even though it is the place from where they come. Also, the fact that they cannot be further endangered by being taken to a third-party state without their safeguards being guaranteed. Now, when we want to guarantee their safety wherever they land up, that means that you are now absconding from the responsibility and you are giving it to the host country. Yes, there will be financial deals that will definitely be on the table about this particular issue, but you are saying, okay, listen, here is some money and you sort it out. It is now your problem. We can see from the onset that this is an untenable solution, and it is bound to cause much more controversy and confusion than anything else.
Now, from another perspective, what could be the implications for the sovereignty of African nations expected to host non-citizen deportees from the US?
Oh, yeah, look, the pretext of all these from the United States as being that it is about national sovereignty of the United States, because the claim is that, well, there are criminals, there are people that have got great infractions against their governments that are going to the United States. So the very same people, if they're not fit enough to be entering the hallowed ground of the United States and now they need to be put somewhere else, are they all of a sudden the reformed people? My logic dictates that perhaps not. So it is the very same problem that the US is purporting to be having, but will just port it to somewhere else. That becomes now the problem of the sovereignty, as is the pretext of the United States as well. So the principle is still the same, and there is nothing substantial that changes.
Before I ask you about the local civil societies or the public opinion or the opposition parties and the reaction to such a draft, let me here ask you, from your point of view, how is that taken? How are these drafts taken by the nations of those countries?
The talks are fairly new, and obviously they are going to be deliberations when those representatives return back to their constituencies, to their parliaments, and the forum that they will have to have the consultative talks with in order for them to rectify their own laws about this particular issue. I do not see that it's going to be an easy process where it is swallowed and accepted across the board and said, okay, well, for the benefit of whatever is that is on the table, then we accept. It doesn't work that way. Democratic states whom are now engaging with, most of whom are engaging now with the presidency of Mr. Donald Trump from West Africa, they also having to be held accountable by their home states. their own oppositions, and I do not think it's going to be a walk in the park. It's going to be a trudelumoodle between the domestic politics that of these countries involved, and it's not going to be something that can be solved just with a stroke of a pen and some couple of checks.
Because you think that before the presidents, those African presidents go, they were not aware by what they were going to face, or they were not aware that of this deal at all?
From what we have seen thus far, since President Donald Trump has come back to office for his second term, we have seen that he's full of surprises.
Mm-hmm.
He's full of surprises. No one can actually know what to expect when they get there. He's got quite a lot of tricks out of his bag, in his bag of politics. He's an unconventional politician. We can only assume that there will be a business deal somewhere that needs to be that he will propose, and or that he will try to foster and iron out. But with that comes a myriad of other aspects that are foreseen, and that's just how he's proven to be as a negotiator. So nobody can tell whether these leaders were actually alerted of what lay ahead. It could well be a surprise, just like as it is anybody else's guess.
Do you see these deportation deals as a form of coercion, trading, migrant control of investments, or diplomatic favor?
It could be both. I do not think anything really with this particular geopolitical development is mutually exclusive. Everything seems to be intercorrelated. But as the presidency of Donald Trump has repeatedly announced to the world that it is about the United States. His mandate is to rebuild the United States at the expense of whoever comes to the party. That is not a consideration. That is a secondary thought, if at all. So I think coercion or strong arming or bringing to the table, however we could choose to term these, they are all within the same umbrella. The point is that the United States is forging ahead to fight for itself, for world domination, and I do not think they will be relenting up until the end of the presidency of Mr. Donald Trump, I'm afraid.
Is there any indication that African leaders will formally ratify these agreements in the upcoming negotiations?
That remains to be seen, of course, because remember, in the democratic process, which many of these countries are subscripts of, the back and forth of democratic process, it takes a long time.
So yes. So how do you think other African Union members, of course, of the African Union, would be reacting to these developments, especially given the EU's previous resistance to migration outsourcing?
I think the general consensus will definitely be disagreement. Yes, there are those that will probably be in favor of this, but in general, let's have a look at Rwanda's deal with the UK that we alluded to before. There were those that were planning, that were thinking of it as an economic benefit. The proponents of migration were for it, but quintessentially the disagreement was that it wouldn't be a good idea. Therefore, I do not think that this round of negotiations will be any different, because migration in itself in Africa and elsewhere in the world, it's a very contentious topic. It's a very contentious discourse that pits one against the other. And I think this is bound to revert back to the same model, where we see that there will be overall disagreement that is in fact long-term in nature as well.
Right. Now, finally, to this segment, is this part of a broader trend of externalizing migration controls by the US and Europe alike?
We could agree that yes, because look, I like to use the example of the UK, because it is the glaring example of how direct and indirect migration and world conflicts can affect one, even though they are far geographically from the source of the problem. Internally within Africa, migration, let's take again the example of South Africa. it's a complete divisive topic that really has more problems than even suggestions of solutions. And this, I don't think it's a short-term issue that can be solved by the stroke of a pen or by any amount of checks on the table for that instance. It is a terrible discourse that really has people's lives at stake. It is a discourse that also has the livelihoods of people at stake because of the competition for scarce resources. I mean, Africa and the developing world, we have a long list of legitimate disputes from the native populations that are being on the waiting list for services and in other provisions from their government. Now bringing somebody else from somewhere because the US does not want them there, it's just going to be a snowball of a very dangerous a global political shift, I think.
Right, Mr. Merita, please stay with us as we go to the other segment and we dive into the trade and investment side of this story. And while the proposed deportation deals dominated headlines, Trump's summit also promised an economic reset, one framed as a pivot from aid to trade. But beyond the slogans, what's actually on offer and who is really cashing in? If we continue on from the New York Times, and the New York Times reports that President Trump's pivot to trade may signal a deeper strategic recalibration, one less about economic opportunity and more about geopolitical repositioning. Hosting 5 African heads of state, none from the continent's economic giants, Trump pitched American investment in critical minerals, ports, and green energy projects as a counterweight to China's growing foothold. Yet this promise of prosperity comes as U.S. aid programs face deep cuts. Visa bans loom over 4 of the 5 nations invited, and many remain unclear on the deal's deliverables. Critics view the summit as an attempt to replace U.S. Agency for International Development program with commercial diplomacy, potentially lying trade access to political concessions. Still, African leaders express cautious optimism, with Liberia hailing a new $1.8 billion U.S. investments deal, but observers question whether this is a strategic realignment or symbolic showmanship in Washington's scramble to regain lost ground on a continent increasingly shaped by Chinese capital and the Gulf ambition. Right, back to you, Mr. Makhilt, and let's turn now to the economic dimensions of this summit, this Trump's so-called pivot from aid to trade. Dr. Bakhilta, how meaningful is this shift away from aid towards trade and investment in practical terms?
I think it's very important to contextualize this particular issue of the U.S. Reorientation of its foreign policy, putting trade on top of anything. President Donald Trump's tenure is still to be tested during the midterms that will be marked during halfway of his presidency. That is the benchmark from which we can say, are his policies really in the right direction? Is his local constituency on board with these? That we still have to see unfolding. However, we know that these are mainly aimed at restoring the dominance of the U.S. and really putting the economics over and above everything else.
Mm. Is this policy shift genuinely new or just old wine in new bottles?
It is not a new development. I mean, I would argue that it is in fact old wine in new bottles, because even during Mr. Trump's first presidency, it was no secret that he said he was elected by the people of the United States of America and nobody else. Therefore, a mandate lies with his fight for the United States of America, regardless of what it does for any other interlocutor that he will have to fix, will have to face. So I think it's old wine that is just now really bubbling to the surface, because also during, let's say, 20 years ago, if you look at the rise of Mr. Trump in the 80s, for instance, the 80s and the 90s, he had a lot of television time where he was interviewed by even personalities like Oprah Winfrey about his political and economic view that he, should he be one day president, would be enacting. And he's been consistent over the years. He's been consistent over the years, so it's not as if we are so surprised that Mr. Donald Trump is coming now with these earth-shattering new policies that nobody has heard of. The man is literally just putting into action what he's been preaching for a long time, as far as I've had the privilege of having to follow his life story.
Now, what do you think is the significance of launching the West African Investment Task Force?
I think that the important thing about this task force, this ECOWAS task force, is that it is not a new development. I mean, ECOWAS task force is not a new development, because the tenets of which can be even traced back to 2016, for instance, that was going to be looking mainly on the economic affairs, the agricultural affairs, the free movement, or at least controlled migration between the region, and the strengthening of the common inhibitions of the region as well. That process has been in the works for quite a while, and it's only just a bubbling up of it now, as the new shifts are now taking place, and that the world is now, Africa itself has to reorientate itself with what the world economic politics have been developing as. So I think to reinvigorate these talks is a positive thing, and the fact that there needs to be a shift, there is a shift, and it is natural, because nothing stays stagnant in geopolitics, and certainly not in Africa.
Now, commentators and critics argue that the focus on trade masks deeper geopolitical goals. What's your take on that?
I would agree. I would agree with that assessment, and I would assert that it is quite a fair assessment, because look, what is economics? Economics is actually politics is actually the power which statesmen, lawmakers have at their disposal to foster their political inhibitions. Whatever it is that the country is going to take a direction of, it is money that is talking, and this is certainly not a different dynamic that is playing out. So the global political shifts are there, but also they are informed by economic interests fundamentally. The primary interest here is economics, and this is not very different from what Asia has done, or the rise of China, for instance. It's rising in the past 4 decades. That is driven by economics. Africa wants the same. For instance, they want their development to be driven also by better political arrangements. The US also is very much unapologetic about the fact that they want the economic reinvigoration, and it doesn't matter as to who else this will affect adversely. So the economy is actually the bottom line of all these political arrangements, I want to argue.
Right. Let me turn to Mauritania's the Mauritania's potential normalization with Israel. That was reportedly discussed. Do you see a peace for investment model emerging here?
This is also a very difficult one, because now that the president of Mauritania was convinced to be engaging on this particular issue, that has been going forward and backwards over the years, over the past 10, 15 years, the whole talk of the Ibrahim Accord, the invigoration thereof. It has been a very divisive political football within the whole entire region, the Arab region, because at the end of the day, Israel, it looks like they will try as much as possible to do whatever they can in order to normalize, even though it is within an environment that is not conducive for a breakthrough right now. So Mauritania, I do not think there will be a deal coming soon there, because judging by what it's been like within the past 10 years particularly, it's been a backward and forward movement, and it's very difficult to think as to what could be offered in order to really have a breakthrough within this rounds of talks anyway, because it's only just a sideshow also of the main diplomatic talks between the US and the five guests from Africa. So that still has to await further developments thereof, but I do not think it is reasonable to expect anything reasonable in the short term.
Mm-hmm. Now, what sectors stand to benefit most from the U.S. investment push if it materializes?
Again, it's an issue. It's an issue of states' selfish interest, parochial interest, what they want. We know that West Africa is one of the regions that is very, very good at capitalizing on the United States education sector, for instance. They, I would imagine, would like to increase or to bargain with that continues. The easing of visas, that we know it's a very contentious thing, that now the students, particularly from Nigeria, will be subject to scrutiny, further scrutiny before they can be given visas. So there is a lot of horse trading and give and take, and at the moment is a very confusing development that we can only just rely on posterity to say, oh well, that was the game plan in retrospect. But right now, it's just there is just too much happening at the same time.
Now, how do African governments view the risk of becoming entangled in great powers rivalries between Washington and Beijing?
I think the entanglement is already underway. I think the entanglement is already underway. I like also to make an example of South Africa. The relationship with South Africa and China, for instance, now being the main or de facto representative of the African bloc on the BRICS umbrella countries, is one of the contributing factors that has put it in the crosshairs with the US and the retaliation and the assaults with all sorts of allegations and economic economic tariffs that are very, very punitive to the tiny economy in comparison of South Africa and other African countries. So there is a definite fighting for repositioning for Africa, but right now it's taking a little bit more of a combative nature with the ascension of Mr. Trump to the presidency of the United States. Is no longer a diplomatic thing of wooing African states for geopolitical support or economic or minerals and all the rest of it. Now it's business. It's really business, business that is unbridled, and it's gloves off in terms of who gets what if they affiliate with who. We can see with the recent sitting of the BRICS countries in Brazil recently, that concluded recently. Mr. Trump made a threat that any country that seems to be taking the side of the BRICS and by extension the Beijing consensus will be facing the full wrath of the United States. And that just goes to telling that there is no more secret about who wants what. Mr. Trump is very brave in telling what he wants, and he wants it no later than now.
Right, Mr. Ling Makilt, we thank you so much for joining us from Pretoria and for your sharp insights into this evolving story. Many thanks for you. And as Washington resets its Africa playbook, offering investments in one hand and deportation deals in the other, the continent stands at a crossroads. What's framed a partnership may also be pressure. What's promised as trade may still walk and talk like transactional diplomacy. We will be tracking the outcomes of the August talks in Monrovia and beyond. So stay with us and we'll get you the news. Many thanks for watching.